course I do.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This week we studied the portion of Shemot. We're starting from selection from Likutei Sichos, the first talk of the Rebbe about the idea of trust. The idea of trust in God. I begin. The Torah first mentioned Moshe's action as an adult in the following narrative. We read about the birth of Moshe, the daughter of Pharaoh saving Moshe, but the first time Moshe himself is doing something is the following. The Torah reads, "And Moshe came of age and went out to his brethren. He saw an Egyptian man beating one of his Hebrew brethren, and he smote the Egyptian. He went out to the next and the next day, and he saw two Hebrew men quarreling. He said to the wicked one, 'Why are you hitting your fellow?' The wicked one replied, 'Do you intend to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?' Moshe became frightened, and he said, 'The matter has indeed become known.'" The Torah continues, "Pharaoh heard, and he sought to kill Moshe, and Moshe fled." So far, so good. So it's a story, simple story. Moshe came out. He saw his brothers and sister being enslaved, working very hard. Medrash said that he assisted them. But he saw one Egyptian officer hitting a Hebrew man. He saw there is nobody around. He killed the Egyptian officer and he buried him in the soil. Next morning, he sees two Jews, two Hebrews, fighting each other. He turned to one that raised his hand and says, "Wicked man, why are you hitting your friend?" And the man says, "Why are you asking? You're about to kill me like you killed the Egyptian from yesterday?" So Moshe said, "Oh, people are aware of this, what I've done." And he feared. Pharaoh heard about this event. He tried to kill Moshe, and Moshe fled. This is the story. And the phrase, "and Moshe became frightened," it says Moshe became frightened and says the matter became known. Rashi comments, the verse should be understood according to its plain meaning. Meaning, the plain meaning, he feared for his life. People know the police will come, the king will try to punish him for killing.
If he was in a royal household, you just said a sword fit.
But killing an officer that represents the king is a rebellious act against the king, and therefore there is the ultimate punishment should be applied. Alternatively, says Rashi, according to the Medrash, and Rashi says that makes it clear, he spells out it's from the Medrash, he was worried because he saw wicked informers among the Jewish people. He thought, if this is so, perhaps they are not worthy of being redeemed. This is way before God appears to him. He just saw that, the Medrash says, he feared. The fear is not for his own life. The fear is for the Jewish people, for the Hebrews. He says they don't deserve to be redeemed if they are fighting each other and they are going to not unite and be together. The question arises, why does the plain meaning that Moshe feared for his life, because it had become public knowledge that he killed the Egyptian, not suffice? Why Rashi needs to add another Medrash? What's wrong with the simple answer? He feared for his life. Why must Rashi also cite an interpretation of the Medrash that Moshe's concern was that his brethren would not deserve to be redeemed, which is not at all alluded to in the verse? In this text, it says he feared. Pharaoh heard and tried to kill him. So now we understand why he feared. The Medrash is about something else. It has nothing to do with Moshe. Behavior. He saw two people quarreling and he says, "Oh, now I know why they're not getting redeemed. I fear that they will never come out of here." In particular, this interpretation of Moshe's fear warrants explanation because it also necessitates interpreting the continuation of the verse. And he says the matter had indeed become known in a non-literal manner. In other words, the Rebbe says if you read the text further, you see that this explanation is not so easy to fit in. I'm not going to read this. And the Rebbe says later, Moshe feared that the matter is become known. What do you mean the matter has become known? So Rashi brings the Medrash and says, now I know why they are not being redeemed. But it's not simple, the simple text. The simple text, the matter become known that Moshe killed an Egyptian officer. In other words, Rashi interjects here a second interpretation, and he says it's a Medrash, and that Medrash does not add anything because we already understand the text. In addition, that Medrash is not so simple, it does not fly with the text properly. Says the Rebbe, it is possible to offer a plain resolution of the above question. Rashi was seeking to address a general difficulty raised by the verse, and Moshe became frightened, and he said, the matter has indeed become known. Why does the Torah mention this point? After all, Moshe's fear did not lead to any immediate action, for he did not flee to Midian until after Pharaoh heard about the matter and sought to kill him. The Rebbe says, read the text again, you will see there is one sentence that has no purpose, seemingly no purpose, and that is, it says that Moshe feared, and he says the matter has become known. What do we care to know that Moshe feared? The text should read that he went out, he saw an Egyptian officer hitting a Hebrew slave, he killed them, he buried them in the soil. The next day he saw two men fighting, and he turned to the one, he says, wicked, why are you doing it? And the man says, oh, you're going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? That's it. And it should say, Pharaoh heard, obviously we know Pharaoh heard because they said it to Pharaoh, and he tried to kill him, and Moshe fled.
Right.
Fled.
The only people.
Why does the Torah bother to say, and Moshe feared, and he says the matter had become known? There must be a whole different meaning. So the simple answer that Moshe feared for his life, if that's the case, then the Torah does not need to bother explaining it, teaching it to us, because it doesn't matter. There was nothing you can learn from it. However, according to the Medrash, that makes sense. Moshe feared. You know how Moshe feared? He says two people are not getting along. It's the reason for remaining as slaves, which is a lesson for us how important it is for us to unite rather than to fight each other. Yes, Harry?
The only people that could, Hamas said, Pharaoh would have been Dustin Aviram.
Not could have. They were the ones, right?
So I'm saying that's the only way that Pharaoh found out.
Right.
Right. So in other words, the Jews were telling on a Jew.
It's right, but this is not the topic of our discussion. Rashi added a Medrash. The reason what Moshe feared is that the Jewish people will stay slaves. Says the Rebbe, what's wrong with the simple explanation? Moshe feared for his own life. Says the Rebbe, that if that's the simple answer, it doesn't make sense to put it in the text, because there is no lesson for us. Therefore, Rashi needed to bring the Medrash that Moshe feared that the Jewish people will remain in slavery.
But it's incorrect. So what is Rashi for? Judge with two people. He's saying that he's including all the slaves that were in Egypt at the time over two people. Over two people.
It's a good point. It's a valid point. So my only answer would be, and these are the same people that cause a lot of trouble later on, right?
Till Korah.
So my only answer is that Moshe says if no one is stopping them, if no one is protesting against that, maybe they all agree to it and accept that.
Well, we know that was the case.
We know that's the case.
Only 20%
Left, right.
So that means 80% stayed, and 80% were the 80%.
And you see that in fact those who came out, the Jewish people did come out of slavery. In other words, the fact that there are two fighters was not a reason to stop them from coming out of Egypt. But this is Moshe's train of thought. He says if two men cannot get along, and then I fear that nobody will come out. We need to assume responsibility for every individual. Ali, did you want to say something? Okay.
So what's changed?
Then they made a decision to allow those people to come in.
What?
Then they made a decision that
They actually came out and they caused a lot of trouble. They disobeyed Moshe by Shabbat on Shabbat, and they came out to collect manna against God, and God was very angry. They are the one who rebelled against Moshe with Korach. There was plenty of times that they had caused a lot of havoc among the Jewish people.
These two people.
These two
But at
men.
the actual crossing, they didn't have to allow them to come.
Correct. So what's the answer?
We are
They
almost
didn't
enemies.
listen to God.
The answer is there is no matter what, among Jews, you always have those troublemakers.
Stay open. Yeah.
I said because we go through, you know,
You just told the story about your relationship with the other Rabbana. We're still here.
what's the connection? I don't understand.
The
I'm
connection
talking-
is-
I am talking about locally. Every Chabad rabbi can tell you stories of a Dasan and Aviram, of two men who caused joy and joy, causing havoc. And the rabbis' patience are being tested continuously. Huh?
Is that where I got it from?
It came from here, yeah.
No, it's where I got the George.
You're not that,
I don't create it.
you're not that
I'll work
lucky
on
to
it.
be
I'll
there.
work on it.
Oh, you're walking
I'll
it.
work.
It's always my goal, stir the pot.
It says by Korah, after Korah, it all stopped. After Korah, they stopped rebelling against Moshe and they obeyed Moshe for 38 years, for 39, for the rest of the journey.
He opened up the earth. and
But,
swallowed these people,
right,
that'll take
but
care of
then
it.
the Torah immediately says, Uvnei Korach lo meisu. The sons of Korach did not die. The simple explanation is they did teshuvah and they survived. That's why we have 15 verses in 15 chapters in Psalm. Lam natzeach livnei Korach mizmor. There is a bunch. However, the Hasidic or the Midrashic interpretation of Bnei Korach, the sons of Korach, did not die because in every generation you have a Korach. You have Korachs.
We only had one review, okay?
So therefore, says the Rebbe, the reason the Torah, Rashi brings the Midrash, not just that he feared for his life, because if that's the reason he feared, the Torah can omit that part that Moshe feared. There is no teaching for us. Therefore, Rashi adds a Midrash. Moshe feared because he realized what an impact it will have on the Jewish people that they are not going to come out from slavery if there are two Jews who are fighting each other. Now we understand why the Torah mentions it. Says the Rebbe, page 5 on the bottom, when a great becomes fighting. Our sages thought a verse never departs from its plain meaning. This principle should certainly apply to the present instance, where Rashi not only gives an alternative, straightforward, kipshuto, simple explanation of Moshe's fear, but presents it before the Midrashic interpretation, umedrasho. In other words, Rashi begins explaining that Moshe feared. The first one means the priority, the most important one, is simply, he feared. He did not know what will happen to him. The second is the Midrash that tells us he feared about the future of Jewish people, but that's the Midrash that comes secondary. Therefore, we must therefore assume that even according to the plain meaning of the phrase, and Moshe became frightened, that he feared for his life because it had become known that he killed the Egyptian, there is an explanation, at least according to the approach of the Drush, as to why the Torah mentions his fear. If it's the kipshuto, the simple explanation came first, and it's much simpler, meaning it takes priority, we need to understand why the Torah bothers to teach us that Moshe feared. Says the Rebbe, to understand about. Let us first cite a comments of the Midrash. And the verse, and Yaakov became very frightened, and he was distressed. On the way back, journeying away from Laban, meeting Esav, before he met Esav, it says, Vayira Yaakov me'od vayetzer lo. Yaakov feared greatly, and he was very distressed. Here is the Midrash. Rav Pinchas said in the name of Rav Reuven, two people received promise from the Holy One, blessed be he, the foremost of the patriarchs and the foremost of the prophets, and nonetheless they become frightened. There are two people in history that receive a promise from God to be protected, and nothing bad will happen to them, and yet it didn't help. They did have fear. One is the greatest of the forefathers, Yaakov, and the other is the greatest of the prophets, Moshe. Both of them feared, despite God telling them, do not fear. What?
I thought Abraham also, Brisbane ceremony, God says you're gonna be okay, he says, prove it to me.
No, but no fear for his life. The only one who feared for his safety is Yaakov, because Esau is standing to kill him. Moshe here too, he feared from Pharaoh killing him. That's a simple explanation.
But he wasn't given a promise yet by God of anything.
Let's find out.
Rabbi,
You said he was given the-
Let's find out.
think about this, he's already judging the people because they're the strife.
That's the Midrash. We are going to the simple explanation. You're losing track. The Midrash is one. Now we understand why the Midrash is brought down by Rashi, because it accommodates why the Torah bothered to say that he feared. It teaches us that when you see two Jews quarreling, there is a danger for losing connection with God. That's one. But says the Rebbe, there is a saying in the Torah, "Ein mikra yotze midei pshuto." You can, no matter how many drash and how many hints and how many different interpretations, you have to assume that the first explanation is the simple text the way it reads. And if Moshe says he feared because the matter has become known, the simple explanation is that he feared for his life. Now we need to understand what teaching does it come to teach us? And that's where we're going. The foremost of the prophets, this is the foremost of the patriarchs, this is Yaakov. The Holy One, blessed be, he told them, behold, I'll be with you. And yet, ultimately, Yaakov became very frightened. The foremost of the prophets, this is Moshe. The Holy One, blessed be, he told them, behold, I'll be with you. And yet, ultimately, Moshe became frightened. This is intimated by the verse, and God told Moshe, do not fear him, Og, and it is relevant to offer the reassurance, do not fear him, only to one who fears. The rabbis tell us later on, Moshe had great fear of Og, the giant. Why did he fear Og? Because Og had one mitzvah. He's the one who told Abraham about about Lot. That Lot was taken captive by the 4 kings, and that caused Abraham to go fight and save his nephew. So therefore, Moshe feared that Og will overcome Moshe, and God says, do not fear him. And yet we see that Moshe still feared Og. Because, so the matter says, there are 2 men, the greatest of the forefathers, the greatest of the prophets, who received a promise from God not to fear, to be assured nothing will happen to them, and they both, we see that they feared.
What's that got to do with now?
So this,
We'll find out.
this brings.
You gotta be patient.
So this brings out the thing with Bitachon.
That's what we're going to talk about. That's the idea, trusting God. The commentaries and the Midrash differ regarding the intent of this message. Some maintain that the Midrash is praising Yaakov and Moshe, although they received promise from God. They did not rely on the promise, fearing that perhaps they had sinned and were thus no longer worthy of having God's promise fulfilled.
What does this have to do with the situation of him fearing saying he became
Without
became
receiving a
He was-
promise
yeah,
yet.
he never
That's
received
your
a promise.
question. I don't know what the answer is.
So it looks like they've gone off into something else and they didn't answer the question.
The Midrash tells us 2 men received direct promise from God not to fear, and yet they feared.
Good.
Regarding Yaakov, it's when he meets Esau. Regarding Moshe, the Midrash tells us it's much later when he took the Jewish people out of Egypt and he's about to enter the Holy Land. He's already 119, I believe.
So it has nothing to do with why he
It's
became.
nothing to
fear-
do with Moshe's fear
Which is-
now
which is
at
our
this point. Soon we will see, maybe it has a connection. Now, the commentators to the Midrash are debating whether it was a positive trait or a negative trait. The positive trait is Yaakov and Moshe feared that perhaps, even though they received a promise, perhaps they misbehaved. They are humble people. And if they misbehave, God's protection is gone. And therefore, it shows on their greatness that despite receiving a promise from God, it was not something that they can rely on because they feared.
They misbehave.
So isn't that misbehaving when God says to him, don't be worried, and he's worried?
Well, God says, don't worry way earlier than that, and they feared. Maybe they, in the middle, they had lost that protection. But however, I'm reading on top of page, I'm sorry. Where am I? The commentators of the Medrash differ regarding the intent of this passage. Some maintain that the Medrash is praising Yaakov and Moshe, although they received a promise from God. They did not rely on the promise, fearing that perhaps they had sinned, and were thus no longer worthy of having God's promise fulfilled. However, other commentaries explain that the intent of the Medrash is that one should not learn from their example. For one ought to not to be afraid, rather one's heart should be settled, trusting in God. This intent is apparent from the plain meaning of the continuation of the Medrash. The prophet Yeshayahu admonishes the Jewish people, telling them, you have forgotten God who made you, and you are continually frightened throughout the day. That is, the prophet rebukes them for being afraid. The view of the commentaries that one ought not to be afraid is worthy of exploration. What is wrong with fearing that one is unworthy of the fulfillment of God's promise because his service is imperfect and he has sinned? In other words, the rabbi is saying you have two opinions about their behavior. One opinion is that it's a great behavior trait because they humble themselves and therefore they did not feel they deserve all the blessings. The second one is that actually something we should learn not to do because God is promising to watch over us. We have no fear. In fact, he says that there is a prophet who actually rebukes the Jewish people for losing trust in God when God says, no worries, I'll take care of you. Says the Rebbe, this question, I'm skipping to paragraph, this question thus draws focus on the nature of the attribute of bitachon, page 7, the last paragraph. This question thus draws focus on the nature of attributes of bitachon, trust in God, which we are commanded to pursue. Bitachon is not merely the faith that God has the potential to bestow good upon a person and save him from adversity and the like. Rather, it means that the person trusts that God will actually do this, and his trust is so absolute that he is completely serene and does not worry at all. The Chovat al-Babot states, a book on Musar that explains about bitachon. The essence of bitachon is serenity felt by the person who trusts. His heart relies on the one in whom he has placed his trust, that he will do what is best and most appropriate for him in the matter at hand. Says in other words, the idea of we need to elaborate on the idea of trust. The idea of trust is that no matter what happens, you have to trust that God will do what's right.
But you can't confuse bitachon and relying on miracles.
Nobody's talking about miracles.
You better have bitachon, you say to yourself, God's going to take care of me.
No, sometimes, no, as we'll discover here, bitachon is trust that whatever is good for me, that's what will happen, even if there is no miracle. So miracle has nothing to do with bitachon. There is no connection.
Nothing happens by accident.
Nothing by accident. The grounds for such certainty requires explanation. Even when a person has an explicit divine promise, it is possible that a sin would cause the promise not to be fulfilled. This surely applies when there is no explicit promise. Moreover, the concern lest sin cause the promise not to be fulfilled is applicable to everyone, for there is no righteous man on earth who does only good and does not sin. If even Yaakov, our patriarch, had this fear, it truly applies to others. Says Rabbi, where do we approach bitachon, trusting God, if we face adversity, and how much more if Yaakov, who had a direct promise, and he was a holy man, he still feared that things may go wrong because he made of sin and lost that protection. How much more so when a person did not receive a direct promise from God? How much more so when a person is not as holy as Yaakov, that we must fear that even if we got a promise from God, that perhaps the sin had caused for that protection to be gone. So how does bitachon, trust, works with the human? The Rebbe is trying to explain one way, a simple way, but it doesn't work. And now we're going to the Rebbe's final explanation on page 11, number 5. The above question can be resolved in light of an adage of the Tzemach Tzedek quoted frequently by my revered father-in-law, the Rebbe Rayatz. Someone had begged him to intercede in order to arouse heaven's mercies. He needed a miracle, and he came to the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Lubavitch Rebbe, and he begged them to intercede on his behalf and ask God to be merciful upon a person who is dangerously ill. A family member that was very, very ill was closer to heaven than to earth. The Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe, the third Rebbe, answered, Tracht gut, wird sein gut. Think positively, and the outcome will be positive. It is apparent from the response of the Tzemach Tzedek that thinking positively, having bitachon, will in itself give rise to results that are visibly and manifestly good. Based on that, the Rebbe will answer and address the issues at hand. In other words, how much more so we need to fear if Yaakov received and Moshe received a promise from God not to fear, yet they feared. And the reason they feared, according to one explanation, is a good trait because they feared for sin. How much us, we don't get a direct promise, and even if we did, how much more so we should fear sin because we're not as perfect. Says the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek helped someone who asked to pray for a very extremely sick person. He told him, Tracht gut wird sein gut. Says the Rebbe, the teaching may be explained as follows. The obligation of bitachon, which we are commanded to cultivate, is not merely a component and corollary of one's faith emunah, that everything is in the hands of God and that He is compassionate and merciful. Such an obligation would not need to be stated separately. Rather, in other words, the idea that God runs the show and whatever happens is from God is emunah, is faith in God. That's not bitachon, that's not trust in God. When the Torah says that we must cultivate the idea of bitachon, of trust in God, the Torah is talking about something else. Such an obligation would not need to be stated separately. Rather, the obligation of bitachon, of trust in God, is an avodah, a service or labor of its own, a separate path of divine service that motivates a person to rely and depend on God alone to the extent that he casts his lot entirely upon Him, as it is written, cast your burden upon God, that is, depend on no other support in the world apart from God. The idea of trust is turning to God only, and only God, not the doctor, not my stockbroker, not my sister-in-law, only God. It could be that this is what the author of Chabad Al-Bavot had in mind when he wrote that a person's bitachon should resemble that of a bondman imprisoned in a dungeon, who is dependent on the authority of his master. That prisoner's trust is directed only toward his master, to whom he is subordinate, and no man other than he can harm or help him. The Chabad al says to us, when you trust in God, think of yourself like a servant, a slave of a master, and the master wants to punish you and he throws you to the dungeon to stay there in confinement for a week. He is going to provide you with food, because if he's not going to provide you with food, you're going to die and he's going to lose a servant. There is nobody else outside. Nobody can hear your voice. You have no rights. No one else has access to provide you with health benefits, financial benefits, food, etc. It's only God and God only that is providing. That's the idea of bitachon, nothing else. We do what God says. Seek the doctor's advice. Try to stay healthy. Stay away from people who are infected with a disease that they can affect you. We need to do all of that. But at the end of the day, bitachon, trust in God, meaning that whatever happens to me is between me and God only, alone. It follows that our trust in God is such that our actual material situation is of no consequence. Even if it is impossible for a person to be saved according to the natural order, he relies on God, who is not restricted by nature at all. In other words, a miracle can happen. That's the idea of trust. This itself is the foundation of a person's trust that God will bestow visible and manifest good upon him, even if he is not worthy of this kindness. In other words, it's nothing to do with how good I am, how much mitzvot I have, how much prayer, how much kosher I keep Shabbat or not, nothing to do. I turn to God and it says, I trust you. I only turn to you. I know that you can save me. You can make a miracle. Now we see the connection to miracle, right, Ali? For the definition of trust is not mere belief that because the kindness of God is utterly measureless and unlimited and can be extended to a person whether he is worthy or not, he will receive God's kindness without any effort on his own part. Where this is to be true, the entire concept of reward and punishment would be nullified. Rather, bitachon, trust, involves labor and exertion within one's soul, and it is this effort and exertion that evokes God's kindness. In other words, you don't just blind faith says, God, hey, it's in you, the ball is in your court, whatever you do, I'll accept. That's not appropriate, because then there are no consequences for misbehaving. The bitachon is, I will do whatever it takes. God says, listen to me. God says, obey my rules. God says, go to the doctor. God says, seek a second opinion. God says, take pills. God says, do exercise. God says, if a relationship is an issue, try to mediate, try to make peace. In other words, we do what God says to do, but then at the end of the day, we realize that's not what will bring the miracle or the blessing, but God himself. When a person truly trusts in God alone, from the depth of his soul, to the extent that he has no worry at all, this very arousal of trust evoked a reciprocal response from above, granting him kindness, even when without taking this trust into account, he would not be worthy of such kindness. If you have that simple trust, again, it does not contradict putting an effort in doing what's right. Because if we don't do what's right, then if we're not worthy of kindness, we're not going to get it. But if we do whatever is right and obey God's commandments and do whatever God instructed us to do, then even if we are unworthy for whatever reason, because our trust is directed towards God in a simple, from the depth of our heart, those who have been to a JLI last night, we talked about the teshuva that comes from Yechida, from the essence. It's a simple connection. Then we are worthy of receiving from God a gift, a miracle. And this is what is meant by the command to trust in God, that a person should cast his burden on God, relying on him to grant him visible and manifest good. Since he trusts God alone, without calculating whether it is possible for him to be saved according to the natural order, this causes a corresponding response towards him in the spiritual realms. God protects him and has pity on him, even if his own tally shows that he does not deserve to be granted the kind of good that is visible and manifests its good. This is the meaning of the adage of the Tzemach Tzedek cited above. Bitachon itself will lead to positive results. This principle is not a tangential element of our trust in God. It defines the nature of the trust that we are commanded to have. In other words, it's not the description of what bitachon is, it creates the connection. If I have trust in God and I say, tracht good, think positive, that God can take care of us, and only God can do it. Again, it cannot interfere with our efforts, doing mitzvot, doing what is God commanded us, is either seeking the doctor's assistance or trying to mediate, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, we are in full trust in God, and we are sure God will do the right thing that will create and evoke by God to act in kindness, even if you are unworthy. I hope I explained it well. That's it? Do I finish?
Is there a concept I've heard?
No, let me give you. Says the Rebbe, now we understand why the Torah bothered to tell us that Moshe feared in the simple text, not the Medrash. Says the Rebbe, because he feared, it created the outcome that Pharaoh wanted to kill him. Had he not feared that Pharaoh will find out, God would have saved the whole ordeal, and Pharaoh will not try to kill him. How do we know? Because Pharaoh couldn't actually kill him. When Pharaoh put the sword on his neck, the neck turned into marble, and the sword broke, and Moshe left. In other words, never heard the story? It's
I
everywhere.
didn't know they caught him.
It says Pharaoh tried to kill him.
Yeah, that's all it says.
He didn't put a wanted. They caught him. They
Okay,
took
I
him
didn't know that.
to a gallows. And Moshe, and he was ordered to be slaughtered with a sword. And God made a miracle, and his neck turned into granite. And instead of the neck getting chopped, the sword break into two. And the people in charge became blind. They didn't see, and Moshe untied his robes and he ran away.
This is a story I've never.
Okay, so this is basic. When I was 3 years old, not 5, 3 years old, I heard it. Now, what we see, the Rebbe says, Rashi says Moshe feared, so we have two explanations. One, he feared it should be told to Pharaoh, and the other, Medrash, is Moshe feared that's why the Jewish people are not worthy of redemption. The second one makes sense why the Torah bothered to write, because it teaches us that's the reason why you are in exile. Okay, but the simple one came first, meaning it's more powerful. So as the Rebbe, we can explain that Moshe feared, and that was the catalyst. That was the one that started the whole ordeal that he had to face Pharaoh. Had he not feared, it would have not happened. Now we understand why the Medrash brings in that Moshe feared. There's nothing to do with our portion, but that helps us understand the reason. Why did Pharaoh and Yaakov and Moshe feared when God gave them? They feared about the sin, a sin take away the protection. And according to some, it was a negative trait that we need to learn not to. Says the Rebbe, the idea is that we need to have trust in God, as explained here, that no matter what, God will do the right thing. God is going to bring a blessing to me. God is going to make sure that a miracle will happen because God can do it. If I have a simple trust in God, it will eradicate and remove all natural barriers because God defies nature. And the same, that's why the Torah bothers to tell us, Vayiro Moshe feared, that without Moshe fearing, Pharaoh would have not heard about that. And that's why we need to read about that. And that's the end of our discussion. Thank you so much.
So I think that you just answered my question, but I've heard the concept called